June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea was quiet. At first. Far to the west, hundreds of Japanese aircraft were climbing into the sky. Their mission was simple: find the American fleet, attack it, and destroy it. Japanese commanders believed they still had one enormous advantage. Their pilots were experienced. Their aircraft were fast, and their carriers had brought wave after wave of planes into the battle. But there was something the Japanese pilots didn't know. The Americans were already waiting for them. Long before the first Japanese aircraft appeared over the horizon, American radar operators had detected the incoming formations. American fighter directors were already positioning their aircraft, and somewhere aboard the American carriers, commanders were watching the situation develop on radar screens. The Japanese were flying toward a trap they didn't know existed. By the end of the day, hundreds of Japanese aircraft would be destroyed or forced into the sea. The Americans would lose only a fraction of that number. The battle would become famous for a brutal nickname. But the real story wasn't simply that American pilots were better. It was that America had transformed naval aviation into something the Japanese could barely recognize. Radar, carrier coordination, code-breaking, combat direction, pilot training, and a devastating new generation of American aircraft. Together, they turned one of Japan's largest carrier offensives into one of the most one-sided air battles of the entire Pacific War. And the Japanese pilots flying toward the American fleet had almost no idea what was waiting for them. By the summer of 1944, Japan was running out of options. The Japanese Empire had once controlled an enormous territory across the Pacific, but American forces were steadily pushing westward. The next major objective was the Mariana Islands. Saipan, Tinian, Guam, these islands mattered enormously because they could become bases for America's new B-29 bombers. From the Marianas, American bombers would eventually be able to reach the Japanese home islands. Japanese leaders understood the danger. If the Marianas fell, the war would move dramatically closer to Japan itself. So Japan decided to fight. The Imperial Japanese Navy assembled one of the largest carrier forces it could still put into the field. The operation was known as a Go. Its goal was to destroy the American fleet supporting the invasion of the Marianas. On paper, Japan still possessed a terrifying force. 9 large carriers, several light carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and pilots who had been trained to believe they were fighting for the survival of the empire. But there was a problem. The Japanese carrier air arm of 1944 was not the same force that had attacked Pearl Harbor. The elite pilots who had dominated the early Pacific War had been devastated by years of combat. Many were dead, and the replacements had received dramatically less training. Japan was trying to replace veterans with inexperienced pilots, while fighting an enemy whose industrial and training capacity was growing every month. That difference was about to become catastrophic. On June 19, Japanese aircraft began launching from their carriers. Wave after wave, hundreds of aircraft disappeared into the morning sky. The Japanese pilots expected to surprise the Americans, but surprise was already gone. American radar stations detected the approaching formations while they were still far from the fleet. This changed everything. In earlier battles, American carriers had sometimes struggled to determine where incoming Japanese aircraft were. Now radar operators could track the threat from a distance. The information could be passed to fighter direction teams, and those teams could guide American fighters toward the enemy. This meant American pilots didn't have to wander across the ocean searching for Japanese aircraft. They could be sent directly toward them. The difference was enormous. Imagine flying hundreds of miles over open ocean, searching for an enemy you cannot see. You have limited fuel. You don't know where the enemy is. You don't know how many aircraft you're going to encounter. And every minute you spend searching brings you closer to running out of fuel. Now imagine the opposite. You're an American fighter pilot. A controller tells you where the enemy is. You climb, you intercept, and suddenly hundreds of Japanese aircraft appear directly ahead. The Americans had turned the Pacific Ocean into a controlled battlefield. One of the most important American weapons that morning was the F-6F Hellcat. It wasn't the most elegant aircraft of the war. It didn't need to be. It was designed to survive. The Hellcat carried 650 caliber machine guns. It was heavily built. It had powerful performance at altitude. And most importantly, it could take punishment and keep flying. Japanese pilots increasingly found themselves facing an aircraft that could absorb damage that would have destroyed many Japanese fighters. The most important advantage, however, was not simply the airplane. It was the system surrounding it. American pilots were being trained in large numbers. They were taught tactics. They practiced aerial combat. And carrier aviation was becoming increasingly standardized. Meanwhile, Japan's pilot training system was collapsing under wartime pressure. The difference would soon become visible in the sky. The first Japanese formations approached the American fleet. American fighters were already climbing toward them. The Japanese pilots were expecting American aircraft to be caught off guard. Instead, they encountered fighter after fighter. The Americans attacked from advantageous positions. Some Japanese aircraft were destroyed before they could even get close enough to attack the carriers. Others became separated from their formations. Some pilots panicked. Others continued toward the fleet. But the American defense kept closing around them. The Japanese had entered an air battle where almost every advantage was working against them. They were being detected early. They were being intercepted before reaching the fleet. They were facing better coordinated defenses, and many of the Japanese pilots lacked the experience needed to survive a chaotic carrier battle. The result was devastating. Japanese aircraft began falling from the sky. The Americans quickly realized just how badly the Japanese attack was going. Reports began reaching the American carriers. Japanese aircraft were being destroyed in enormous numbers. Some American pilots described the fighting as almost surreal. The Japanese formations were large, but they were struggling to penetrate the American defenses. American fighters attacked repeatedly. Aircraft carriers launched additional fighters, and American anti-aircraft defenses waited behind them. For the Japanese, the situation became a nightmare. They had expected to attack the American fleet. Instead, they were fighting their way through a defensive system that seemed to have no obvious weakness. The phrase "turkey shoot" would later become associated with the battle because of the extraordinary imbalance. It was not a single attack. It was a series of engagements throughout the day. Again and again, Japanese aircraft approached. Again and again, American fighters intercepted them. And again, Japanese aircraft were destroyed. But there is an important part of the story that is sometimes forgotten. The Americans did not simply fly into the sky and effortlessly destroy everything. They had their own problems. The Pacific was enormous. Aircraft had limited fuel. Navigation was difficult. Communications could become confused. And American pilots sometimes struggled to locate the Japanese fleet after breaking away from combat. Later in the battle, American aircraft faced another danger. They had to return to their carriers. Many pilots were running dangerously low on fuel. As darkness approached, American aircraft began trying to find their way back. Some couldn't locate their carriers, others were forced to ditch in the ocean. Admiral Mark Mitcher made the controversial decision to illuminate the carriers to help guide returning aircraft. It was dangerous. Carrier lights could potentially expose the fleet. But the priority was getting American pilots home. Aircraft began landing late into the evening. Some were badly damaged, others had almost no fuel remaining. Pilots were exhausted. But the American fleet had survived, and Japan's carrier aviation had been shattered. The obvious question is, how could hundreds of Japanese aircraft be destroyed in a single day? The answer was not one secret weapon. It was a combination of advantages. First, the Americans could detect incoming formations long before they reached the fleet. Second, radar information could be transformed into instructions for American fighters. Third, the Hellcat and other American fighters were highly capable and extremely durable. Fourth, America was producing large numbers of trained pilots. Japan was increasingly struggling to replace experienced aviators. And fifth, American intelligence had been studying Japanese communications and operational patterns for years. The Americans were not fighting blind. They had increasingly good information about what Japan was capable of doing. The Japanese had spent years building an offensive carrier doctrine. But by 1944, America had built something different. A complete, integrated system. Detection, command, communication, aircraft, pilots, ships, and logistics. The individual components mattered. But the combination was devastating. The Japanese carrier force survived the battle physically, but its air power was crippled. Hundreds of aircraft had been lost. More importantly, hundreds of pilots had been lost, and pilots were much harder to replace than airplanes. Japan could build aircraft. It could not quickly manufacture experienced combat aviators. Every veteran pilot killed in the Philippine Sea represented years of training that could not simply be recreated. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the battle hoping to destroy the American fleet. Instead, its carrier aviation had been pushed toward the edge of collapse. The strategic consequences were enormous. Japan could no longer rely on its carrier force to dominate the Pacific. The balance of naval air power had shifted decisively. There was another reason the battle mattered. America was no longer simply responding to Japan. America was now overwhelming Japan with resources. More carriers, more aircraft, more pilots, more fuel, more ammunition, more radar equipment, more spare parts, and an industrial system capable of replacing losses at a scale Japan could not match. An American pilot who lost an aircraft might receive another. A damaged carrier could be repaired. A destroyed aircraft could be replaced. But when Japan lost a veteran pilot, the replacement might be a young aviator with only a fraction of the training. This created a vicious cycle. More inexperienced pilots entered combat. More were lost. Training became even more desperate, and the quality gap continued to widen. The Philippine Sea demonstrated what industrial warfare looked like when combined with technological superiority. Before 1944, Japanese naval aviation had been one of the most feared forces in the world. Pearl Harbor had demonstrated its power. The battles of 1942 had shown how dangerous Japanese carrier groups could be. But the Philippine Sea was different. This time, Japan was attacking an American fleet that had evolved. The Americans had learned. They had adapted. And they had built a defensive system capable of absorbing a massive attack. The Japanese pilots who entered the Philippine Sea were not simply confronting American fighters. They were confronting years of American adaptation. And that is why the battle became such a disaster. The destruction of Japanese aircraft was only part of the catastrophe. As the battle continued, American submarines were also hunting Japanese carriers. On June 19, the submarines US Albacore and US Kavala attacked the Japanese fleet. The Albacore sank the carrier Taiho, the newest and most advanced Japanese carrier. The Kavala later attacked Shokaku, one of Japan's famous fleet carriers. Both ships were lost. So while Japanese pilots were being destroyed in the sky, American submarines were striking the fleet beneath them. The Japanese carrier force was being attacked from multiple directions: air, sea, and beneath the surface. By the end of the battle, Japan had suffered a disaster far greater than the loss of aircraft alone. The exact numbers vary depending on how losses are counted, but the scale of the Japanese defeat is unmistakable. Japan lost roughly 300 aircraft during the major air actions of June 19. American losses were dramatically lower, and Japan also lost 2 fleet carriers to American submarines that day. The imbalance was so extreme that the battle became one of the clearest demonstrations of America's growing dominance in Pacific naval aviation. The Japanese had launched a massive attack, and it had effectively destroyed itself. Imagine being one of those Japanese pilots. You launch from your carrier. You know that somewhere ahead is the American fleet. You're flying hundreds of miles across open ocean. Your fuel is disappearing. Your formation is becoming scattered. Then suddenly American fighters. Not one, not 2. Groups of them. They seem to be everywhere. You try to climb. They follow. You dive. They attack. You attempt to regroup. More fighters appear. And behind those fighters is the American fleet. You finally reach the outer defenses, only to encounter anti-aircraft fire. The attack that was supposed to destroy the American fleet has become a desperate struggle simply to survive. For many pilots, there would be no return flight. Their aircraft would disappear into the Pacific, and many would never know exactly how the Americans had been waiting for them. So what did America know? The answer wasn't simply that Japanese aircraft were coming. America knew much more about the Japanese operational picture than Japan realized. American intelligence had been working for years to understand Japanese naval communications. Combined with radar and reconnaissance, this information helped commanders build a clearer picture of what was happening. But intelligence alone couldn't win the battle. Radar alone couldn't win it. The Hellcat alone couldn't win it. Training alone couldn't win it. The victory came because all of these elements worked together. That was America's real advantage. Not one miracle weapon. A system. The Battle of the Philippine Sea did not immediately end the Pacific War. Japan still possessed powerful naval forces. The war would continue for more than a year. There would be brutal battles. There would be kamikaze attacks. There would be enormous casualties. But the strategic direction of the war was becoming increasingly difficult to reverse. The Marianas fell. American airfields were built. B-29 bombers eventually began launching raids against Japan. And the Japanese carrier force would never recover its earlier strength. The Philippine Sea had demonstrated something Japan could no longer ignore. America had become overwhelmingly powerful in carrier warfare. The Battle of the Philippine Sea is sometimes remembered for a number: 300 Japanese aircraft. But that number doesn't tell the whole story. The real significance was what those aircraft represented: years of Japanese naval aviation doctrine, thousands of hours of pilot training, experienced combat aviators, aircraft that Japan could not easily replace, and an entire carrier strategy that had once terrified the Pacific. In one disastrous day, much of that power disappeared. The Americans didn't win because the Japanese suddenly forgot how to fight. They won because modern warfare had changed. Radar could see beyond the horizon. Radio could direct fighters. Industrial production could replace aircraft. Training systems could produce pilots at scale. Submarines could strike carriers from beneath the surface, and intelligence could reveal an enemy's movements before the enemy understood what was happening. The Japanese pilots flew toward the American fleet, believing they were hunting their enemy. But the Americans had already been waiting. And when the sky finally filled with aircraft on June 19, 1944, the outcome had already begun. And the Japanese carrier air arm would never be the same again. This was the day the Pacific War's balance of air power changed forever. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot.